Welcome to the Indomitable podcast. I'm your host, Di Cerullo, and today we have a very special guest that will leave you inspired. My guest today is Paul Micallef. Paul is an autistic life coach, speaker, facilitator, and trainer with a passion for neurodiversity and emotional intelligence. Leveraging his own lived experience as well as insights gained from many years of working with the autistic community, Paul seeks to promote emotional and psychological safety by bridging the empathy gap between mainstream and neurodivergent culture. Since discovering his own autism at the age of 30, Paul has worked with a variety of mentoring and educational roles, helping parents, students, and teachers to understand the human side of autism. His YouTube channel, Autism from the Inside, has close to 300,000 subscribers, and his annual online Lived Experience Autism Summit brings dozens of actually autistic speakers to the global audience. Wow. Hello, Paul. I am so happy to have you here. Thank you so much for joining me. I am you're even just reading your bio, obviously, so impressed, so excited to have this conversation, especially given, all of, my listeners in my community. I never shut up about neurodiversity or having ADHD or my children being part of our neurodiverse community. So I'm so excited to have you here.
Yeah, it's a really rich topic, so I'm sure we're going to have fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So before I get too far into the conversation, tell me a little bit more about yourself. You already started chatting about you were an aerospace engineer. Just chat with us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I used to be an aerospace engineer. I worked on the 787 Dreamliner in Melbourne and in Seattle. So that was fun. At about the age of 25, I had my first massive life crisis. And that kind of started a lot of extra balls rolling. And then I ended up going through a divorce, losing my house, leaving my job, going traveling by myself for a year and a half. And when I got back, I discovered that I was actually autistic as well. And so that was like a new chapter of self-discovery, which has been the last several years of my life, exploring what that means for me, figuring out how that links into my lifelong passion for emotional intelligence. It's not an exaggeration to say that it's been my special interest for over 30 years. So how does that come into the neurodiversity discussion? Well, actually, it makes a lot of sense because I needed to figure out how other people worked. And that's part of why it ended up being my special interest. And so when I discovered my own autism, the first thing I did was decide to shave my head on camera. I'd had dreadlocks for 15 years and I thought, great, let's cut them off for charity. That'll be fun. There is a much deeper story about that because they were my mask and I kind of felt like I needed to leave them behind and embrace my new identity in a way, because I was using them to mask my autism, to hide it from everyone else and myself at the same time. So that was a big part of my journey, and part of that was starting a YouTube channel and starting volunteering for various autistic charities, and then teaching parents and teachers about autism, and finally figuring out that life coaching fits me a lot better than engineering did, because I'm allowing myself to tap into those natural strengths around reading people and the patterns that I see. And I really love listening. I really love stories. I really love emotional intelligence and neurodiversity and all of that. And it's kind of coming together. So in a nutshell.
I don't want to even get myself off topic, but I love what you said about pattern recognition, because honestly, when it comes to people, we neurodiverse people are built extra for pattern recognition. So since my hyper focus is people, I will be I will be having a conversation with people, and just the way they move or the way that they talk, my brain is constantly calculating what I know about these people and making educated guesses. So I'll just be in a room and I'll be like, ooh, and I'm counting how many autistic people I can see, right? Like I'm just like, oh, okay, okay, like, and it becomes part of who you are. So I'm always so excited that I get to talk to somebody else that's like, oh, okay, cool, you can see this stuff too. Fantastic. I'm not insane.
One of the reasons I'm so passionate about emotional intelligence is because when I was teaching myself all of this stuff, basically how to survive in the world socially, I was asking questions that no one had answers to.
Right.
I was asking questions like, why do I need to say hello? What's the point of that? What's the point of small talk? What's the point of all this stuff? What's the purpose? Why do people do this? And for me to be able to do those things, I needed to understand the why behind it. But the neurotypical adults around me just did not have any answers to those questions, or at least their answers would be something like, because that's what you do.
Yeah.
Which was less helpful.
Even less helpful.
So I kind of, now that I've found answers to those questions and they're really exciting, I want to share those so that others who are asking the same questions, I'm sure there are others out there asking the same questions.
Yes.
They don't have to learn things the hard way.
Right.
And I would really love to see one day that emotional intelligence is taught in every school as crucial as like maths and language, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because if we aren't teaching that, the first thing kids like us are experiencing is that rejection from people who don't understand, right? And we are so impacted by that rejection. So I think that's awesome. I love that. All right, let's talk about emotional intelligence first of all. I was joking with you before we started recording that I always have sort of this conversation with people who assume that autistics don't have emotional intelligence or can't learn emotional intelligence, and that the gap exists on the autistic side. And in fact, I have noticed it to sort of be the other way, where neurotypical people will maybe not ask questions the same way we do, not use questions the same way we do, not necessarily follow rules that they set in the same way that we will obsessively follow social rules and cues. So do you teach neurodiverse people how to teach emotional intelligence, or do you teach neurotypical people how to read emotional intelligence? What is your take?
I often get both
Yes.
because the neurotypical population who come to me probably have a very important autistic person in their life,
Yes.
whether it's a child or a partner or a friend or a colleague. So I kind of feel like my role is a bit of a cross-cultural translator in that way,
Yes.
which is sort of valuable to both sides. The thing about trying to survive in the world is that the autistic population actually do have a significant disadvantage in trying to learn these skills.
Yes.
Because if I imagine that everyone else is like me, that's probably not a good first guess.
Right.
And if my first guess, my first try at a social interaction is way off the mark, the chances of me getting a second try are pretty low.
Right.
Whereas for the neurotypical population, if you just assume that the person you're talking to is roughly the same as you, that's going to mostly work most of the time in a lot of situations. You won't get it exactly right. Of course, everyone is different, but it'll be close enough for a first guess that you can then iterate and get better after that.
Absolutely.
So what I find that was definitely the case in my life is that when I was trying to make friends, especially as a young child, I just wasn't I was getting the answer so wrong in the beginning that it would trigger this rejection reaction, this ostracism by all the other kids.
Right.
And then you can't learn social skills sitting alone by yourself when the other kids don't let you play with them, right?
Right.
So it's kind of like a circular cycle there. But to what you were saying, I've definitely met a lot of people who have developed a very high degree of social awareness and self-awareness and very sophisticated strategies to allow them to get by in the world because they had to. So I was kind of in that category. One of my ways of explaining this is it's a little bit like trying to go to a very foreign country and figure out how they do things in a place that is incredibly different culture to your own.
Right.
Everyone around you kind of knows what the rules are, but you've got to figure them out by yourself.
Right.
And that requires an extra degree of awareness and
Right.
attention and effort. And
Mm-hmm.
If you had to try and pretend that you weren't a foreigner,
Yeah.
that would be even more difficult. So I tend to embrace, I even call it the foreigner strategy,
Yes.
where I am obviously the odd one out here. I'm
Yes.
not from here. I don't know how you do things around here.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives me a little bit of grace whenever I don't do what's expected. It's because I'm the odd one out. Right? It's
Mm-hmm.
because it's not my culture.
Absolutely. I'm the same. That's what I do. I embrace it right away. I'm always like, look, I'm going to be like this. I can't hide any of this. There's nothing I can do about it. Feel free to be upset about this, but also let me know if I'm doing something wrong. That would be super duper helpful. That's how you could help me out. And then it's like, if you could hang out for the explanation, that would be even better. Like, agree. Absolutely every time. I think masking, I get why we do it. I get why it's necessary. It's just, I was diagnosed so much earlier than a lot of the people in my community that I had no choice but to accept it and learn about it and own it as quickly as I possibly could. So, speaking of that, what finally convinced you that what you were dealing with was autism?
So it was a pretty quick, actually. I basically read a book called Look Me in the Eye by John Elder Robinson.
Mm-hmm.
I got about halfway through that book, put it down, and called a local support group and attended the meeting the next day, basically.
Yeah.
So it was all about getting an accurate idea of what autism looks like in adults, essentially.
Yes.
I have a memory of asking my dad what autism was when
Mm-hmm.
I was, I don't know, 6,
Mm.
something like that. I'd heard about autism. I asked my dad what autism was, and he explained it to me like this. He said, your average child will play with a toy truck and like pretend it's a truck.
Mm-hmm.
And an autistic child will put it on its back and spin the wheels.
Okay.
And pretty typical understanding of autism in the early 90s.
Right.
And I thought, that's really weird. I'm clearly not autistic. And so what I did with my trucks is smash them together and see which one had the better balance and see which
Yeah,
one
of
could flip one over.
course.
And in hindsight, at no point did I pretend that my toy trucks were actually trucks.
Right. Right.
I was more interested in their physical properties than
Right.
in pretending that they were trucks.
Right.
But that is the kind of thing that you just don't put two and two together. You don't join the dots necessarily
Right.
until there's a better, more relatable example. So
Right.
it was through reading that book that I got a different take on what autism might actually look like in real life.
Right. Well, I've always found that autism and all neurodiversity for that matter, we're always explained from the outside. We're always understood from the outside, which is why I love the name of your YouTube channel, because I was looking at it and I was just like, exactly. Exactly. Anytime I was discussing or explaining or trying to advocate for myself as an ADHDer, I would be told, "Oh no, you can sit still. You can't be ADHD. That's just for little boys." And I would be like, how is that science? How is that what do you mean? Like, and it was only ever explained to me as the traits that other people would be annoyed by. So girls must be chatty and little boys must be hyperactive, and we were always just so I was
And
always
if
at
you're not those
odds with.
things, if
Yes,
you're not those
exactly.
things, then it's not a problem. So it's not a
Exactly.
diagnosis.
Exactly. So I had such a hard time with always the opposition to what I was experiencing versus what I was having it explained back to me as. So I was just very excited that that was your experience as well, because it is so impossible to self-advocate to people who have already decided that you're the problem. So,
And it turns out there's a word for this that you might be familiar with. It's called the double empathy problem.
yes.
And so just like earlier, I was saying that when I was trying to make friends as a kid, I would get the answer. My first guess would be way off, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because of my lack of understanding of what the other person was going through.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's quite similar with people trying to understand what I'm going through. Very often when people try to support me, what they try to do is just so unhelpful that I get into the habit of saying, no, thanks, I don't need support. I don't need that kind of support. That kind of support is actually so unhelpful for me,
Right.
which means I never learn how to accept support. Other people never learn how to adequately support me or understand what's actually going on for me, because there's that double empathy problem where they can't relate to me either.
Right. Where are you at, if you don't mind my asking, in your sort of self-advocacy? Are you finding that you're doing a better job with that, a better job saying no, for example, a better job um, warding off burnout? I have the opposite problem, and I will always be burned out, probably for most of my life, because I get really excited about everything. So how does that work for you?
So obviously lots of challenges.
Yes.
The desire and energy to do things can sometimes be counterproductive in the long term, because I want to just keep doing what I find interesting,
Right.
and it's harder to take breaks.
Hmm.
What I've found to be one of the best strategies for me, though, is to pre-plan social time and breaks in advance,
Hmm.
because it takes my brain a while to switch from one thing to the next thing.
Hmm.
So if I'm focusing really intently on one thing that's quite productive, eventually I'm going to get tired. And then when I realize that I'm too tired and I need to stop, and then I do stop, my brain is still there, and
Hmm.
I don't have the energy within myself, the executive function, to pull it out.
Hmm.
It's like it's like trying to stop a train.
Yes. Yes.
There's a huge amount of momentum there,
Hmm.
and trying to focus on something else is really difficult unless it pulls you. So when I'm around other people, when I have other stimulus, when there's something else that I can be doing, then the external activity can actually pull me out of that hyper focus.
Mm.
Whereas if I have to just sit at home by myself and entertain myself, my brain is naturally going to stay in that initial way of focusing because there's just so much momentum there. So that's
Yeah.
one thing. But you also mentioned the boundaries thing, and I
Mm.
also get very excited about boundaries.
Mm.
I've got a webinar coming up in a couple of weeks on personal boundaries. It's another one of those things where the more I learn about it, the more I want to just tell everyone how
Yes.
incredible this is.
Hmm.
Um, the the catch that a lot of people don't always realize is it's really easy to think it's either me or the other person, and it's
Right.
kind of like
Right.
an either or situation.
Hmm.
And actually, all of the success that I've had, it's been putting both of those together and saying, how do I meet my needs and the other person's needs at the same time?
Right.
And when that happens, then it works really well. And it's another one of my favorite concepts. Again, another way to flip this is a boundary sounds like you're keeping someone out,
Mm.
whereas actually a boundary is your point of connection. My skin is the boundary between me and my physical body and the outside world. It is also the point of connection between me and the outside world. So
Absolutely.
boundaries are the way that we connect with people.
Mm-hmm.
And once I reframe that in my head, suddenly, how do I connect with people? I need really good boundaries. And the better boundaries I have, the easier it's going to be to form really meaningful connections with other people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The older I got, the more I realized boundaries were about what I would do, not about what I would set for other people to do. So I think that the older we get, the smarter we get, thankfully.
And it works for teaching others about autism as well.
Yes.
Because one of the best ways to set an autistic person up for success is to have strong boundaries around them.
Mm-hmm.
So I would do a lot of relationship coaching, and often it's like, how do I get my partner to do this? How do I, all of these kind of things. And ultimately, the answer is have a really strong boundary and say, this is what I'm going to do,
Mm-hmm.
which empowers them with the option to respond to that.
Right.
And then they can either respond and say, yes, great, I can do that for you. Or they can say, actually, I don't have the spoons to do that for you at this time.
Absolutely.
And then either way is fine. And you've set the other person up for success.
Yes.
So I also use that strategy of setting really strong boundaries with other people in order to set them up for success.
Has that made it easier or harder knowing what you're doing? Making friends and, it has knowing helps.
I see what you mean, because there is a trap, and the trap is to work really, really, really hard in the background.
Yes.
To get even minor stuff done.
Yes. Absolutely.
But part of setting those boundaries and unmasking and integrating all of the parts of myself is that I don't necessarily need to spend all of that energy.
Yes.
And I can set my boundary earlier and say, this is how much I've got to give today. And that's enough for today. I'm going to come out to the pub on a Friday night after work for like 20 minutes, and then I'm going to go home.
Awesome.
Right? Because I would really love to see people, but I don't want to stay more than 20 minutes.
No.
Right? So in some ways, it can also take the pressure off, because as we were discussing before, it's so tempting to try harder in a situation.
Yes.
To overcome a particular barrier.
Yes.
Like, I want to make friends, so I'm going to push myself to connect with my colleagues by staying at the pub for an hour after work on Friday.
Right.
And it will probably work in the short term. But as a long-term strategy, that's when we start getting into burnout territory.
Absolutely. Absolutely it is. And there's also sort of those social conditions around doing the things that other people expect of you, or the things that other people, for example, going to a bar after work I'm sorry, you say pub, but going to a bar after work when you are with other work people and you're expected to stay a certain amount of time, and how do you set up those boundaries? How do you have that discussion? Do you know what I mean? There's also those social contracts that are happening around us all the time as well, that we have to just be not even just conscious of, but have an explanation for at every turn, So I think it's a hard path, but it's an important one. So I agree with you that those are such important boundaries. So when you're coaching adults, what is the question you get the most about autism, and how to deal? There's no cure. There's no, there's nothing wrong with us. So how do we deal better in a world not built for us?
So the biggest question it's more like a topic. It's around burnout and self-advocacy, essentially.
Of course.
So all of what we've been talking about, it actually all is part of the one question, the one problem, which is, how do I turn up in the world in a way that works for me?
Yes.
And succeed in the world at the same time.
Right.
And if I focus on being me all the time, then what ends up happening is I put up a barrier and I don't let anyone in. And I say, look, you either need to accept me all of the time, or I'm not going to interact with you. And that's I call that stonewalling.
Yes.
Where you're basically locking yourself away and blocking out the rest of the world. And it's almost like rejecting the whole world in advance, because they were going to reject you anyway.
Yes.
And then you've got the other side of masking and camouflaging and working really, really hard to do everything that everyone else wants.
Right.
In order to succeed in the world.
Right.
Which works in the short term.
Right.
Until the fact that it's incredibly inefficient strategy starts showing its downsides.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
And interestingly, the advocacy piece is actually really tied in the middle of that. Because if I am being myself and succeeding in the world, I need to change myself a little bit. I need to say, well, what version of myself is the best version to bring to this situation? So I'm not just being too rigid there, but I'm sort of adapting a little bit in the situation. Right. But at the same time, I should be asking for what I need in a situation as well.
Right. Right.
If I'm going to be considerate of someone else, and it makes sense for me to be considerate of someone else, it makes equally as much sense to ask someone else to be considerate of me.
Right.
And when we have both of those things, then things have a much better chance of working out.
Right. Absolutely. So we see a lot of, let's say, movement in areas of the US like Silicon Valley and other types of tech industries and biotech industries around sort of wanting to capture the genius of autism. I have my own thoughts, but I would love to get some of your thoughts on why that might be a little bit of not the way we should go about this.
Well, like everything, there's an element of truth in everything, right? So the element of truth is that a lot of autistic people are not living up to their potential.
Right. Sure.
And we are not being given the opportunities to really shine.
Right.
So a nice way of framing that goal would be, wouldn't it be fantastic if we could set up a society where autistic people, or just everyone, gets the opportunity to excel at whatever they are good at.
Right.
There are a couple of myths though that's kind of muddy the water a little bit in terms of how this is implemented in practice. So one of the myths is that all autistic people are good at tech stuff, right? Because we're equally likely to be good at some other kind of less mainstream creative endeavor.
Right.
Creativity, my version of creativity is creating spreadsheets.
Excellent. I love it. Tell me everything.
And that's not your average artistic hobby on the weekend.
Sure.
So then the next question would be, how do we support people to share their talents in that way?
How do we? What is not just sort of what are the circumstances and conditions one might create to make a neurodiverse individual, specifically an autistic individual, more comfortable in order to allow them to be their best self? What might that look like, do you think?
There are a couple of ways of approaching that. So there are some really high level philosophy ways.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, valuing diversity in general
Yes.
leads to a whole bunch of cultural things that are just really helpful.
Yes.
So, yeah, valuing diversity in general.
Right.
Managing anxiety is another really
Right.
big one.
Yes.
So, you can't really talk about this without addressing the fact that a lot of people have experienced trauma in their life.
Yes. Yes.
So
Mm-hmm.
the really easily understandable mainstream version of this is look up trauma-informed care.
Yes. Absolutely.
When we my version of this is we should all learn emotional intelligence, but the mainstream version of this is look up trauma-informed care. We know a lot about how our neurology responds to challenging situations, to overwhelming situations. We also know the correlation that a lot of the autistic community, a very large number of the autistic community, experiences challenges in that area.
Yep.
Whether it's from past experience, whether it's from microaggressions, whether it's from sensory trauma, whether it's from whatever it is. So we're actually managing our own nervous system so that we can respond well in a situation. And the very first step in that process is to essentially calm our anxiety so that we can connect with other people.
Absolutely. Yep. I always start with
I just thought of my number one tip with that, take anxiety seriously. That's it.
Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. I always start with sort of people will say to me whenever I go in for a training, "Oh, you mean like more fidgets?" And I'm like, really a lot more than that. really, really like so much more than that. Like everything from your lights to the sounds to your, everything. Just even the ambient noise that you think is just that nobody else can hear. The computers are buzzing and you can't hear it. Like everything else.
I was once doing an assessment at an autistic school in New South Wales. Like an audit of things. It was a purpose-built school using all the best design strategies, purpose-built autistic school. And I was just curious. And so I was playing with the dimmer switch on the lights and I just turned it like 10 degrees to the left. And the lights went down just a tiny bit and you could viscerally feel everyone in the room just relax, just a little bit. And I'm not talking about the students. I'm talking about the staff, the others on the tour, everyone. Just, it's like we all took a collective breath at the same time. I didn't say anything. They all turned around and looked at me and go, "What did you just do?"
Yeah. Right?
Like, I just turned the lights down a tiny bit. And then they start going on about, we need to remember where that switch, someone put a little mark where he just put that. Where he just turned that light down.
Absolutely.
And
goes
why
back
was I
to
able to do that? It's just an awareness.
Inclusion is for everybody. Yep, exactly.
It's just an awareness that you can train that kind of awareness.
Of course. Do you ever feel like you are in a circumstance where you have to not use the knowledge you have to potentially protect the community? And what I mean by that is I have been in circumstances where I will have people ask me how you can tell that someone is neurodiverse without them saying that they are. And I have always dodged that question because I don't think it's okay. Now, can I tell? Yes. Am I going to tell? I am not. And that isn't just neurodiversity, that's also queerness and every other, intersection of identity that exists, right? Do you ever feel like you would have to protect some of the things that you know in order to keep maybe even just well-intentioned, but often going about something the wrong way, actors, let's say, from from maybe causing more harm than good with your knowledge?
No. But
Lucky you.
I kind of I have a slightly different way of I see what you mean by that problem, and I
Yeah.
have a slightly different way of approaching that thing. So um, I'll answer that in two parts. The first part is, do I tell people who are obviously autistic that they are autistic? The answer in most of the time is no.
Right.
Most of the time.
Right.
Sometimes there will be an opening to ask someone,
Mm-hmm.
but if I'm not sure, then the answer is usually just,
Right.
that's not my place to
No.
tell people.
Agree.
I made a video on how to spot autism,
Mm-hmm.
and the point of that video is that we can't diagnose autism from the outside,
No.
but we can spot difference in a
Right.
microsecond unconsciously.
Of course.
That is what our brains and
Literally what they do.
society, the social evolution of how we
Mm-hmm.
work.
Mm-hmm.
We spot difference
Mm-hmm.
unconsciously, naturally, all the time, and we ostracize people because of difference
Yes.
unconsciously, naturally, all the time.
Yes.
So if you're seeing someone and you notice that they're a bit different,
Mm-hmm.
notice that reaction in yourself. Notice the prejudice, basically, that your
Mm-hmm.
body is saying, be really careful of that person. They're unpredictable. You shouldn't have anything to do with them, which
Mm-hmm.
is what our brains shout at us whenever something is different.
Mm-hmm.
Difference is scary.
Of course.
And when we start to become conscious of that, we can actually ask the question, well, is that correct?
Mm.
No, it's not correct in this situation. In this situation, the person is just got a few tics, or
Sure.
isn't looking at me, or has a weird way of dressing or something. And I can still include them and talk to them and treat them like a normal person, and then actually see what happens after that. So yeah.
Yes and no.
I hope that sort of answers your question. I don't feel like there's a danger in sharing my knowledge, because the way I choose to share the knowledge is to broaden the question to it's actually not helpful to label people as autistic from the outside.
No.
Well, it's not always helpful, at least.
Not always
what
helpful.
is much more helpful is recognizing difference and attempting to include all types of difference.
Absolutely.
Because we value diversity.
Build inclusion practices around it. Yep, absolutely. So in that same vein, we both work with kids. We both work with, I like to say, neuro sparkly babies. When I am at the school, sometimes, I'm at an elementary school a lot, I will have kids that I am working in a classroom with, and I will notice that what we are dealing with is probably neurodiversity with, let's say, 5 to 10 of them, right? Like it's getting up there. Bigger than the average that we're calculating, right? So if we're calculating that between 15 to 20% of the population at any given time is neurodiverse, we are looking at a little bit of higher representation in our schools. Now, that could be for a lot of different reasons, but it's kind of what I'm seeing. My point with this question is, I will sometimes see a child that is very obviously exhibiting signs of having either ADHD or autism or any other neurodiversity condition, let's say. And I will say to the teacher, for example, oh, Johnny over there seems like he might benefit from these types of things. And they will say to me, oh, yes, we are well aware of Johnny, but unfortunately, Johnny's parents do not want to hear that Johnny might be experiencing autism. Do you run into the fact that that neurodiversity is still so stigmatized that occasionally, too often, parents would rather believe that their child is having behavioral issues than that the child is actually potentially ADHD, autistic, or any of the other neurodiversity umbrella conditions?
That definitely still happens quite a lot, especially in certain cultural groups as
Yes.
well.
Yeah,
It can
absolutely.
be that prevalence of the stigma
Mm-hmm.
within a certain group can be can be more. I also often hear that with adults.
Yes.
So I'll be coaching someone and their partner is obviously autistic.
Yeah.
But the option of actually naming that and talking to them about it is just not one that would be helpful in the situation.
Sure.
So I usually take a much bigger approach to all of those things rather than focusing in on the one person or the one family and saying, well, what can we do to help them get rid of the stigma?
Right.
Stigma is a societal thing.
Yes, exactly.
And half of my work is just trying to show real life autism,
Yes.
the pros and cons, the highs and lows, so that it doesn't need to be something that we're scared of.
Right.
And
absolutely.
And the key message is the self-awareness message that when we learn about these things about ourselves, it's actually really helpful. Part of learning you're autistic, for example, is just starting to look around for that word. Well, what has helped other people? How do I meet other people?
Right.
Oh, I've never tried a fidget before. Maybe I'll try it. Maybe it works for me. Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah.
And then it just opens the door to look for solutions that work for other people and get suggestions on things that might work for me as well.
Absolutely. So removing the stigma at a societal level is much more helpful than trying to change somebody else's mind. I completely agree with that. As I've said probably thousands of times, because we are known to repeat ourselves, inclusion helps everyone. I know I asked about like what people ask you. What would you say are some of the things that you get a lot that are absolutely fake, that are absolutely just, you wish that you could kill them and bury them in the ground? What are some of those things that you get a lot?
Probably the two biggest ones is confusing the word spectrum with the word continuum. And related to that, people trying to help by using terms like high functioning. They're probably the two biggest ones that come up the most and have really subtle negative consequences
Very much.
People don't always realize. So this is the way I end up explaining the spectrum. It's like a spectrum is like a rainbow.
Right.
And when you've got blue and you've got orange, which one is more on the spectrum? They're both on the spectrum. They're different types of the spectrum. They're completely different. So very often people say spectrum, but they mean continuum. From low to high.
Yes.
It's a linear line, and it's one variable.
Right.
A spectrum is not one variable.
No. Right.
And then similarly, with the high functioning challenge, there's lots of ways to explain it, but probably the simplest is to replace high functioning with high masking. So yes, I am very good. Someone calls me high functioning. Yes, I am very good at masking in these situations.
Yes. Not everyone can.
It's not exactly the same thing, but it starts people thinking about the right types of questions around, oh, maybe when I don't see you, there's another side of you that I'm not seeing.
Right.
That's kind of the question we're trying to encourage people to ask.
Right. And that runs right into the fact that people normally put everybody in their own boxes based on their own perception, and it never really has anything to do with you anyway. So you're really not even just trying to teach people about autism. You're trying to teach people about humans. You're trying to teach people about humanness. That's fascinating.
One of my favorite quotes from Barry Present is, "There's no such thing as autistic behavior. Only human behavior."
Only human behavior. Yep, I absolutely agree.
And that's one of the reasons that teaching emotional intelligence allows the neurotypical population to empathize
Yes,
with autistic behavior.
absolutely.
We all know what it's like to be overwhelmed by something.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes.
So emotions are actually what allow us to connect with other people and understand their experience.
Absolutely. Do you get a lot of people telling you that everybody's a little autistic? I get a lot of,
Yeah,
I say that because I get a lot of, oh, everybody's a little ADHD. And I'm always like, okay, thank you for that feedback. Appreciate it, Sheila.
that's probably number 3. After the first 2 that I
Oh,
mentioned
okay. So we're
earlier,
just going through the list. Yeah.
that's probably number 3. It's a little bit similar to the continuum concept, and
Yes.
once you blow the continuum concept out of the water,
Yes.
then it's easier to. But nature has. You're just getting all of my explanations for all of these things, how I often
Good.
describe it to people.
I'll take it.
But it's like a near miss.
Mm-hmm.
You can like, it's like if you get closer and closer and closer, eventually you're going to hit something.
Mm-hmm.
And if I clip another car with my car,
Mm-hmm.
suddenly that's a big deal. But if
Yeah.
I miss it by a quarter of an inch,
Right.
it doesn't matter. So in the autistic example, if most of your social things mostly work out most of the time, then we call that, close enough to neurotypical that there's not a problem there.
Right. Right.
But if there's a certain tipping point
Mm-hmm.
where if your first guess is too far from the right guess, you don't get a second chance.
No.
Or you're less likely to get a second chance. And then that snowballs because, well, you didn't learn from that. And so you're less likely to get it right next time. And then when
Right.
you're less likely to get it right next time, you don't get a second chance, which means you don't learn from that, which means you're even less likely to get it right time after that.
Right.
And so there is this kind of natural tipping point.
Mm.
And that's one of the things that we're trying to describe. So we're not all on the spectrum. There
Right.
actually is a real tipping point that we're trying to describe. And the good news for that is that we can help.
Right.
We can help provide people opportunities to learn. We can help
Absolutely.
give people second chances so that they're included.
Yes.
And then we're kind of bringing people in rather than letting the spiral that we've noticed actually keep going.
Absolutely. I always say that the difference between sort of those traits for an ADHD, or at least probably for all of us, I always say that the difference in those traits and those behaviors and those circumstances and the stigmas associated with them have more to do with the word often than anything else. Like often misses deadlines. Like, of course, everybody misses deadlines. Of course, everybody goes through a lot of the behaviors that we're experiencing. But when you add the word often to that conversation, that's when we start seeing problems and stigmas and feedback that you're getting from people or not, but you're still getting the consequences of not understanding how to move in a world that isn't yours, So
another really good example of a tipping point is if you often have trouble paying attention in school.
Yes.
But it's not bad enough and you end up staying in school,
Mm-hmm.
that's a big difference to
Yeah.
often having trouble at school and ending up getting kicked out of school
Absolutely.
and not having access to education at all.
Absolutely.
So when you add up these types of tipping points
Yes.
are relationships, jobs, schools, inclusion in different things, then suddenly you've got the difference between someone who struggles sometimes, but
Yes.
still has a relationship with their family,
Yes.
got through school, has a job,
Yeah.
has friends,
Yeah.
versus having none of those things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. So, since you're in Australia, are there any issues that are different when dealing with neurodiversity between Australian government support and American, let's say, government / medical / whatever support? Are there things that you're noticing as you move through the community? Differences?
The healthcare in US versus Australia is vastly different in lots of ways. So
Quite.
Yes. Number one, yes. Number two, it's not really my area of expertise.
Sure.
Because my job is not to help people manage the healthcare system.
Sure.
To give
Manage
you
is
an
an interesting
example,
word there. That's doing a lot of work. I love it.
to give you an example, in Australia we have a national disability insurance scheme that provides functional assessments and government funding for supports to help you if there are, especially it works especially well for children, and you can get some support as an adult depending on certain things, but that's like a nationally funded scheme. So most of the questions in Australia are, how do I navigate that scheme?
Yes, I get why. I mean, we are all often trying to navigate our schemes as well here, especially as we look to getting diagnosed, getting help, getting medicine, not being able to get medicine, dealing with, whether or not people think we are deserving of medication based on how we look. I get a lot of feedback, oh, you don't look like you need it. And it's like, perfect. I'll go ahead and take my mask off and we'll make ADHD for you. So is it the same for you, or is it the same in Australia, or is it?
There are a significant, people still experience a significant amount of that. And there are certain gatekeepers to the system.
Yep.
And if they don't see your disability, then it can be hard to access services.
Sure.
That said, there are a lot of positive stories. There are an increasing number of successful diagnosis stories and people actually successfully accessing the system to get help. So it's quite encouraging to see more and more professionals educating themselves on what neurodiversity looks like in real life.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of people educating themselves, I think probably people are going to want to reach out to you and follow you and continue having this conversation with you even through their screens. How do people do that?
So you can go to my website, which is autismfromtheinside.com.au. AU for Australia, AU for autism, whichever you prefer. And we've got a bunch of webinars and training sessions. I'm doing a deep dive into unmasking in December 2023. So that should be really good to be able to unpack some of these things. I've also got an online emotional intelligence course. I do life coaching and a personal boundaries webinar as well, also coming up later this year.
Perfect. So just make sure you get me those links. I'll have them all in the show notes for everybody that's watching. I would love this conversation to go on forever, but I am sure you have very many amazing things to do today. So thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for, your work in this field. I truly appreciate it, especially as a parent that has autistic kids. That's it's so important, and I'm so grateful to everyone who's putting that time and effort into educating everybody around them. So thank you so much for joining me today. I truly appreciate it. Y'all, thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. Please don't forget to subscribe to the Indomitable podcast for more incredible stories of humaning. If you live local to me or you are in the Boston area and you're listening to this show on upload day, which will be Tuesday, November 28th, please come and see me tonight at the Copper Dog Bookstore in downtown Beverly, where I'll be signing copies of my new foster care memoir, Indomitable, a foster care story, at 6 p.m. I'd love to hear what you think of it. And friends, I am so happy to have you here in community with me. And remember, together we can truly be indomitable. Take care.